And we're back again. Pastor Dave here, pastor and shade tree theologian, and wanted to continue with some supplemental information that I didn't have time to cover in our Saturday night sessions of teaching. This one, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the 144,000. I know that a lot of people are interested in that, and there's all kinds of different things that go around and all kinds of different speculation and all. The 144,000 that are mentioned in Revelation 7. This is not to be confused with the television show, The 4400, which is an excellent show, by the way. 4,400 people vanished mysteriously. The only thing stranger than where they've been is what they've become. So we're not talking about the 4,400, we're talking about the 144,000. Now, when we look at the 144,000, there are a lot of religious movements and different sects of people down through history that have identified themselves literally or symbolically as the 144,000. You hear this term that's kind of tossed around quite a little bit. And the 144,000 are mentioned in Revelation 7 and also Revelation 14. We'll talk about the number itself and how it came to be, but I'm going to just briefly mention a few groups in history that claim to be part of the 144,000, and there's more than you actually might believe in here. The Montanists in the 2nd and 3rd century believed that they were part of the 144,000, so going all the way back to the 2nd and 3rd century. And they were an early prophetic Christian movement founded by Montanists of Asia Minor. And they connected themselves to the 144,000. They believed that they were in the end-time prophetic community, as some people believe now that they are. They emphasized spiritual purity and a martyr-like devotion. And they actually expected the New Jerusalem to descend soon. And so they were a small elite group of believers. They were not numerically precise, but nevertheless they believed that. Then in the Middle Ages, you had some radical apocalyptic sects, various fringe groups during the times of plague and war and instability. They believed that they were part of the 144,000. They believed that society had become Babylon, and so the faithful minority would be preserved. And so they kind of believed this type of thing. So there were some apocalyptic monastic groups that formed and those type of things. The Anabaptist apocalyptic movements in the 1500s, the Munster Rebellion, which was about 1534 to 1535, they saw themselves as part of the 144,000. They believed that they were actually establishing the New Jerusalem on earth. And so they saw themselves as a pure gathered church. And so they expected imminent end-time judgment. So there have been all kinds of groups down through history that have thought about that. And then we move to the 18th and the 19th centuries, the Shakers, the people that quaked and shook and all of that, founded by Ann Lee. They were connected to 144,000. They emphasized celibacy and purity. And so the reason that they did is because Revelation 14 talks about the 144,000, that they were not defiled. And so they saw themselves as a restored apostolic community in there. Then the most famous of the modern claims, of course, are the Jehovah's Witnesses. And this is the most explicit and systematic identification in the modern times. So their teachings, exactly 144,000 Christians are anointed to reign with Christ in heaven. The rest of the faithful believers live forever on a restored earthly paradise. And so they believe that the number is literal and limited, which is kind of sad, because what if you're not part of the 144 chosen? And so 144,000 chosen. So, and they believe that selection began in the apostolic age and continued. So there was only 144,000 from the apostolic age all the way until now that we're going to make that. And so they hold to that literal reading of Revelation 7 and 14. And so they make the distinction between the heavenly class of the 144,000 and the great crowd. Other sheep, the earthly hope is what they call them. There are some Seventh-day Adventist offshoot groups and that believe that they are part of the 144,000. The mainstream Seventh-day Adventists generally see the 144,000 as symbolic, but there are several splinter movements that claimed to be part of the end time 144,000. And so Shepherd's Rod was one of them. The Davidian groups were one. The Branch Davidians believe that with David Koresh. And so they believe that. And then there are various modern prophetic and restorationist ministries across the 20th century and into the 21st centuries that feel that they are sealed and the end time remnant, and they are part of the 144,000 as God is restoring the true apostolic church. And they see the institutionalized church as fallen Babylon. And so they believe themselves to be part of the 144,000 on that. Most of these groups, the reason that they do this is desire for certainty in chaotic times. And so whenever we have plagues and wars and rumors of wars and things, people feel that they need to have some type of an escape or something. And so they see themselves as part of this 144,000 when the social collapse comes along. And so they kind of seek assurance that they're protected from these type of things that are coming. So some of it is born out of goodness, but yet we're going to talk about the 144,000 and see about that, because some of these groups see themselves as literal members of the 144,000, some as symbolic interpretations of being with the 144,000. And so there's some different areas there within that. So historically, most mainstream Christian traditions, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, have understood the 144,000 as, some of them understand them as symbolic and complete people of God, and also representing spiritual Israel. We're going to talk more about that in a minute, and why it is that they have that. So there's some different groups. The Restorationists, the apocalyptic, and the sectarian movements all thought of themselves as kind of the 144,000 there. So, okay, now let's talk just a little bit of the first century. We go into this quite a little bit on our Saturday studies of how John wrote Revelation, and he is writing it in the first century. So as he writes it in the first century, he understands the first century rhetoric. He understands the first century terminology as he is writing Revelation. And so as he describes things, he is describing them the best that he can in the first century prose of that time. Okay? Now, with the first century, the Jews would have understand the number of the 144,000 a little bit deeper than we have today at first glance. And so the number is actually built on sacred covenant structure. And so a Jewish listener to the book of Revelation, because remember at the very beginning, it says that you are blessed not only for reading the book of Revelation, but also for hearing the book of Revelation. And so it was the concept of reading the book of Revelation out loud to the first century so that they could see the things that were coming in the future and understand that and see what Jesus was saying to the 7 churches in Asia. And so they would understand that. And so the Jewish listener would understand that to a certain extent. Time for a tea break. Okay, so the Jewish listener would immediately recognize the mathematical symbolism. First of all, you have the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, we're going to talk more about this in just a little bit. And 12 times 12 is 144. And then the 1,000 would be the large completeness or the fullness. So the 144,000 would be the complete perfected order of the people of God. We'll get into this more in just a little bit. Okay, so with Jewish theology, there is a lot of numbering and a lot of number systems and things. Rabbi Jason Sobel goes into that a lot. He's pretty fascinating to listen to also. And so, if you want to really kind of get into the different numbers in the Jewish faith, and then also, of course, in the book of Revelation, he's got some interesting teachings out there on that. So the Jews thought that numbers often functioned like theological shorthand for the most part. So the number of 7, the number of perfection, the number of completeness, and it indicates divine perfection. The number 10, you may not have known, is the Jewish thought of totality. And so then the number 40 is testing, 40 days and 40 nights, that type of number there. The number 12 is the covenant people, or the tribal fullness. And so when the Jews heard the 144,000, it would sound like the full covenant community perfectly preserved by God is the way that they would interpret the 144,000. Okay. Now, they also would see the term the faithful remnant a little bit differently, maybe than we would see it. The Second Temple Judaism strongly emphasized the concept of the remnant preserved through judgment. So the Old Testament background on this, Elijah thought that he was alone. God had preserved 7,000 faithful people to be there. Remember that Elijah was kind of having a little bit of a pity party. And he said, I'm the only one that serves you. And God said, well, not exactly. I've reserved 7,000 that have not bowed their knee to Baal. This is 1 Kings 19 when he talks about that. Isaiah also speaks of the remnant returning. And Ezekiel speaks of those marked for protection. So when Revelation comes along and talking about the sealing of the 144,000, it's kind of referring back to that on that in that aspect there. So also there's military muster imagery. Another strong Jewish association is tribal military census language. And so Numbers 1 and 2 record Israel being numbered tribe by tribe. And so this was in preparation for battles, for journeys, for conquest of the land, all of that. Revelation's going to echo this style with the tribes listed, the number of groups, and the seal people before the coming judgments. So that's a little bit on that. So it's kind of an end time army that they're talking about in there. In Jewish apocalyptic literature, which happened and started about 200 BC, if I remember correctly, there were some other connections there. For instance, end time salvation, the restoration of Israel, and purified worship. And so then when we come along in Revelation 14, we're talking about Revelation 7 right now. We're going to talk more about that, but along in Revelation 14, the 144,000 are morally pure. They sing a new song, and they are called the first fruits. And so there's definitely that symbolism that comes along with that. And so the Jewish people would think of them as the purified worshiping community of the last days. Okay, now we are going to get more into this in just a little bit with the tribal listings in Revelation, because if you are familiar with the 12 tribes and you've kind of been studying this a little bit, you'll notice that the tribe of Dan is missing, and the tribe of Ephraim is replaced, and the tribe of Levi is included. We're going to talk more about that in just a little bit. And so these tribes that the book of Revelation is talking about represent reconstituted spiritual Israel, and God's forming a new covenant with them. And so there's some difference there on that. There are some other apocalyptic writings, and don't shoot me for this. There are different ones that are not part of the canon, so they would not be part of the 66 books of the Bible, but they're interesting reading, and they are called Jewish apocalyptic writing, and like First Enoch, the book of Enoch, interesting book to read there. Fourth Ezra, Ezra, and second Baruch. And so they use a lot of these symbolic numbers and structured heavenly group and sealed righteous communities. If you do get a hold of these, and a lot of those are free, you can download the PDFs and read them, like the book of Enoch and all. Remember that they are not part of the canon. They are not part of the 66 books of the Bible. There are certain groups that do recognize them, of course, and I'm not going to debate with that. They haven't stood the test of time as the inspired Word of God, but they're interesting reading there. And there are some groups that say that they are inspired. So you can kind of take that with a grain of salt and go out and research those yourself and all. And so when we've got that 144,000 there are some interesting things to consider. Now, in Revelation 7, we often see some patterns that John hears different things and he sees different things. In Revelation 7, John hears the number of the sealed as 144,000, and then he sees the great multitude, which are not part of the 144,000, but they are the multitude that have come to Christ during the Great Tribulation. So we're going to see further in our study that there are going to be multiplied millions or billions of people that come to Christ during the Great Tribulation. We don't know what the number is. It just says that there's a multitude there. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that in there. Okay, now let's go down and let's read. Let's actually read from Revelation 7 for just a moment here. Just going to scroll down in my notes for a bit. Feel free to take a drink of tea as you're waiting. Okay, so Revelation 7. John says, after this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth. This is not to indicate that the earth is a block or that it's flat, but it's just a poetic way of talking and saying that. So standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back its 4 winds, so that no wind would blow on the land or sea or on any tree, which is kind of interesting because we think of the wind as cooling things and, bringing fresh air in and all. And at this point, John is saying that there's no wind that's blowing on there. And I saw another angel ascending from the east with the seal of the living God, and he called out in a loud voice to the 4 angels who have been given power to harm the land and the sea. Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we have placed a seal on the foreheads of the servants of God. Now, as we will see in the future, in the teachings in Revelation 13, when the Antichrist is revealed, this is when the mark of the beast comes in, which is the number of man, 666, 666. And it talks about in Revelation 13 that the followers of the beast, the followers of the Antichrist, are going to get this mark in their, either on the back of their hands or in their foreheads. And so they are sealed in their foreheads, and they take the mark of the beast, which, again, we will talk about a little bit later. You cannot, on earth, you cannot buy or sell or trade or get food or any of that without the mark of the beast. That's the way that the Antichrist will set it up. So it's interesting here that in Revelation 7, that John says, do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until I have placed the seal on the foreheads of the servants of God. This is the sealing of the 144,000 of these servants of God. And John goes on in verse number 4, and he said, I heard the number of those that were sealed, 144,000. Now notice the next thing that he says. The ones who were sealed, the 144,000, from all the tribes of Israel. Now we talked just a little bit ago about all the different sects of Christianity that felt that they were part of the 144,000, including the Jehovah's Witnesses and some different branches of the Seventh-day Adventists. So the next time that the Jehovah's Witnesses comes and knocks on your door, you can ask them if they are part of the 144,000, which most of them will tell you that they are, or they're working toward that. And at that point, you can ask them, well, which tribe of Israel are you a part of? Because it's very plain in Revelation here that it says that the 144,000 were from the tribes of Israel. So John goes on to expand on this, and he says, from the tribe of Judah, and we're going to go into why the tribes are listed the way that they are in just a moment here. So from the tribe of Judah, 12,000 were sealed. From the tribe of Reuben, 12,000. From the tribe of Gad and Asher and Naphtali and Manasseh and Simeon and Levi. Notice Levi is in there. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Issachar, all of these 12,000 were sealed. From Zebulun, from Joseph and Benjamin, which is interesting also. And we're going to talk about that. Okay, so that's down through verse number 9. And John says, after this I looked and I saw a multitude, too large to count, from every nation and tribe and people and tongue, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. And they were wearing white robes and holding palm branches in their hands. And they cried out with a loud voice, salvation to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. So what we've got here is John sees two groups of people. He sees the 144,000, which are Jews, 12,000 from each tribe. 12 times 12, 24. Okay, so 12,000 from the 12 tribes, 144,000. And then after that, he sees a multitude that he can't count. And they are people that are not Jews. They are from every nation and tribe and people and tongue. Okay? They may also be Jews too, but you've got certain ones that are sealed like that. But they are all standing before the throne. Now, this multitude is also people who have come out of the Great Tribulation. See, the thing is that teachers have taught for a long time that when the rapture happens, the Holy Spirit is taken out of the world, and we talked about this last Saturday. In order for people to come to Christ, the Father has to draw them, and he draws them through the Holy Spirit. So in order for people during the Great Tribulation to come to Christ, the Holy Spirit still has to bring them to him. When the rapture of the church happens, there are still going to be videos around, there's still going to be sermons around, there's still going to be Bibles around, there's still going to be Christian books laying around, all of these type of things. And so people are actually going to come to salvation during the Great Tribulation. It's one of the greatest revivals that will happen. And this goes back to God's grace. Even during the Great Tribulation, even during God's judgment that is being poured out upon the earth, yet he still has that line of grace that he is still going to bring people to him. And these are the people that John are seeing. And he's seeing a multitude that are too numerous to count of people that are coming out of the Great Tribulation. This is not the church. This is not you and me. We have already been raptured. We're already with Jesus. The reason that I can say that is because when Jesus comes back, he's going to bring the multitude back with him, another multitude, which are the saints that had been raptured. Okay, and so John sees these, and notice that it's from every nation, every tribe, every tongue, every people standing before the throne, and they are wearing white robes. In Revelation, whenever you see somebody wearing a white robe, it's a sign of righteousness. And they are wearing white robes, and they are holding palm branches. Remember the palm branches that they laid down as Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem? And they were crying, Hosanna. This is very similar to that, and it's the branches of peace. And so they are saying salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. And verse 11 goes on and says, and all the angels stood around the throne and around the elders and the four living creatures, and they fell face down before the throne and worshiped God, saying, Amen. Blessing and glory and wisdom and thanks and honor and power and strength be to our God forever and ever. Amen. That's another thing about Revelation, is it's not only talking about the greatest revival in history, but it's one of the greatest books for worship in the Bible also, because constantly you're getting a picture of heaven, and you're getting a picture of the to come of the new heaven and the new earth, and it's all filled with worship constantly. So Revelation 7:13, John goes on, and he says, then one of the elders addresses me. These in white robes, he asks, who are they, and where have they come from? And when he asks that question, John writes, and he says, hey man, I don't know. He says, sir, only you know. And so he replied, these are the ones who have come out of the Great Tribulation. So this is a reinforcement of what we were just talking about, that these souls, these multitudes, and this 144,000 Jews were coming out of the Great Tribulation, and they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Verse 15, for this reason, they were before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. The one seated on the throne will spread his tabernacle over them. And I talked about this a little bit last week. And we could spend a great deal of time just on this little phrase here that says, the one seated on the throne will spread his tabernacle over them. Now, keep in mind who it is that is penning the words of the book of Revelation. Remember, it's Jesus' revelation that he is giving to John, but John is writing it down. So keep in mind that John is the one who is writing this down, right? Remember that John also wrote the book of John, the books of 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation. So let's go back to the Gospel of John 1:14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The literal Greek word there is tabernacled. This is a picture looking back into the Old Testament of the tabernacle of God that Moses had in the wilderness. Hopefully, after this study on Revelation, I'm probably going to go into a study on the tabernacle and all the symbolism and all that goes along with that. But suffice it to say right now that God instructed Moses to build the tabernacle in a certain way because it represented the presence of God, and that was where God dwelled in the Holy of Holies, and how it was that mankind could come back in and meet with the children of Israel. Now, we don't have time to go into all of that right now. It's not the right area here. But I want you to notice here in Revelation 7, for this reason they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in the temple. The one seated on the throne will spread his tabernacle over them, which refers also to John 1, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling, or tabernacled, among us. The same word in the Greek. We have seen his glory, and the glory of the one, the only Son of the Father. The Greek word is skenu, and it means to tabernacle or to pitch a tent or to dwell, to encamp, or figuratively to occupy and reside with God. And so the elder is talking to John, and in verse number 16 in Revelation 7, he says, "Never again will they hunger, and never again will they thirst, nor will the sun beat down upon them, or the scorching heat. For the Lamb," this is verse 17, "for the Lamb in the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes." Just a side note here, and this is kind of my own thought here. I'm not necessarily thinking that there will be no tears in heaven, because I think that there's still, probably with you and me, will still be emotions. There'll be joy, there'll be laughter, there'll be worship, there'll be praise. I think that that tears will probably be there, but they won't be tears of sorrow. A lot of times we have emotions that are tears of joy. And when the Bible talks about God wiping away every tear from their eyes, I believe that he's probably talking about specifically these martyrs that are before the throne, because they had to be martyred during the Great Tribulation in order to get here at this point. Later on, we'll see that in Revelation. But I think that he is talking about here that God is going to wipe away their sorrowful tears from their eyes. Now, that's my own opinion. I don't know necessarily that we have scripture to back that up. But you know, we might be able to see that a little bit there. Now, chapter number 7 is a little bit of a parenthetical statement or a phrase there, because what happens in chapter number 7, chapter number 7 of Revelation, when it talks about the 144,000, there's kind of a pause from the carnage. Before this, we have the seals that have been opened and all these horrible things that have gone on the earth. And then there's a pause in 7, and then 8 again we pick up with the trumpets, and then later on the bowls and the judgments of God, and as they get progressively worse. And so this is kind of where we are, where we're kind of seeing that a little bit in chapter number 7. Time for a tea break. Okay. So we've got two groups that we're talking about. We're talking about the 144,000, and then we are talking about the innumerable multitudes there. But remember that as we are talking about the 144,000, that we are talking about Jews on there. okay, in this particular area. Okay, so let's go back to the tribes again, and as they are mentioned and why they are mentioned the way that they are, and why there's certain ones that are omitted, basically, okay? It seems to be one of the biggest puzzles in Revelation about this. So when we look at Revelation 7, 5 through 8, the tribes are listed in a way that no Jewish reader would expect, basically. And that is intentional. So as we look at this, the way that John gives the listing is he puts Judah first, and then Reuben, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Simeon, Levi, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Now, if you know anything about the 12 tribes, you notice immediately that Dan is missing. Also, Ephraim is not named directly. And Levi is included. Now, when we, as we go all the way back to Genesis, we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? Jacob is the one that has the 12 sons. Remember that the 12 sons were also the ones that conspired against Joseph, threw him in the pit. They were going to kill him. Then they sold him into slavery. Later on, he saves the children of Israel, right? As Jacob is dying, he gives the blessings to his sons. And these are the names of the sons here. As we fast forward a little bit, and as we go into Moses, into the Exodus, and going out into the wilderness, and the encampments, and all of that, and then later on when they get to the Promised Land, they are given certain rights to certain land masses, and all. Now, the reason that I'm telling you this is remember that the tribe of Levi, who were they? They became the priests, right? They did not get a land allotment. They did not get a land settlement because what they did was they served in the house of the Lord. They served in the tabernacle and all. And so they didn't get land that was given to the other tribes, okay? Normally, Levi is not counted in the list because they are a set-apart tribe that is to the ministry of the Lord, okay? Notice also that in this list that Judah is listed first, when normally in the list Reuben is, because Reuben was the eldest. So Judah is listed first. Remember that in the book of Revelation that Jesus is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Jesus comes from the line of David, who David was from the tribe of Judah. And so Jesus is called in Revelation the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Okay? And so this is signaling a theological symbolism rather than a genealogical symbolism. Okay? Okay, so as we look at this then, Judah is mentioned first because of the messianic emphasis, because Jesus came from the tribe of Judah. In the Old Testament, Reuben was Jacob's firstborn, and so that's why it was that usually the tribal list began with Reuben. But in Revelation, it begins with Judah. And so the first century Christians would immediately have thought the Messiah comes from Judah. That's the way it was prophesied. Okay? In Revelation 5:5, Jesus is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And so now what happens is that the covenant people, with this 144,000 and the way that it's listed there, are now defined around the Messiah. And so it is a Christ-centered Israel list. Okay? Is everybody okay so far? Take another drink of tea. Now, the tribe of Dan is omitted. The reason being is because the tribe of Dan was associated with apostasy and idolatry. And this is very significant here. And it's kind of interesting. Dan became a major center of idolatrous worship. So you can go back and you can read this in Judges 18 and also 1 Kings 12. Okay? Jeroboam, the king back then, placed a golden calf in Dan. And later, the Jewish tradition, sometimes connected with Dan, is connected with apostasy, serpent imagery, which comes along Genesis 49:17, and even the Antichrist speculation in some writings. Some scholars and some theologians believe that the Antichrist will come from the tribe of Dan because of this apostasy. That could be true. Don't know within that. And so, since Revelation is about spiritual purity and sealing, then many scholars believe that Dan symbolizes unfaithfulness and therefore the exclusion in there. Okay? So you can kind of take that, for what it's worth. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. Now, Ephraim, the tribe of Ephraim in this list, was replaced by Joseph, avoiding another idolatry association. Okay? Normally the lists include Ephraim and Manasseh, but in Revelation it's Manasseh and Joseph. Okay? Ephraim also became associated with the Northern Kingdom rebellion. Remember that Israel was divided into the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom. The Northern Kingdom was Israel. The Southern Kingdom was Judah. David came out of the line of the tribe of Judah, and so he was over Judah and Benjamin. Okay, so Ephraim becomes associated with the Northern Kingdom rebellion, idolatry, worship. One of the kings of Israel, of course, was Ahab, which was one of the most wicked kings with his queen Jezebel. Okay? And so there's a lot of idol worship that went on in the Northern Kingdom. And also there was a prophetic judgment in Hosea against that. And so John possibly may be retaining the full tribal symbolism while removing names that are strongly tied to apostasy. Now, by using Joseph, he still includes the northern tribal heritage, but it's a purified form in there. Okay? So that's why it is that that Joseph comes into there, and may go into that more in just a little bit here too. Now, Levi is included. Remember that they were the priesthood. And the priesthood is expanded to all of the sealed tribes also. Levi, generally, as we just talked about, is normally excluded because they were the priestly servants. They were not tribal warriors, and so they didn't get a lot of the land that is there. But Levi in Revelation is counted among the sealed. So, the end-time people of God are the kingdom of priests. Revelation 1:6, Exodus 19 talks about that. They are a priestly army, a worshiping nation, a sanctified covenant community. Okay, so that's the tribe of Levi there. Manasseh is listed separately, maintaining the number 12. Because remember that if Dan is removed and Ephraim is renamed Joseph, then they need another tribe. And so they have to add that. So Manasseh is explicitly named. So John is shaping this deliberately, or Jesus was, as he was giving it to John, to preserve symbolic completeness. and not necessarily a historical sequence in that. Okay? And so the list there is not geographic, it's not by birth order, it is theological. The way that it is put into that. So what the first century Jewish community might be hearing through this is that God is reforming Israel in the last days. The unfaithful elements are being obliterated, they're being removed. Manasseh defines the new covenant identity, and the people are sealed like in Ezekiel's vision. Okay? And the true restored Israel of prophecy is not tribal record keeping, but it is prophetic theology in that form, in that list that's there. Okay? Okay, now, as we talk about this, there is a part of Ezekiel's restoration vision that kind of comes into play here. And so this is one of the deepest Old Testament backgrounds behind Revelation 7, and this is an Ezekiel prophecy. John is not inventing this imagery that we see here randomly. Remember that we have talked about a lot in our studies how John reaches back to the Old Testament and uses symbolism from the Old Testament as kind of a grounding or a foundation for some of the things that are going on in Revelation. And so we see that that John is doing this. So what we want to look at here is we want to look at Ezekiel's restoration vision, which is coming from Ezekiel 9 and 37 and 48, in order to kind of understand what's going on. We're going to take a slight break here. And we're back with part 2 of the 144,000. I knew that this particular part of the teaching would get long, and that's why I could not cover it in our Saturday session teachings on Saturday nights. And so even in this, with the first part, we went about 45 minutes or so with about the 144,000, and there were a lot of you that had questions on that and wanted to learn more about it. So that's why I put together these supplement videos, and I was going to try to do it all in one, but it was getting a little bit too long, so we broke it up into 2 parts. So this is part 2 of the teaching about the 144,000. And what we left off on here was also the way that John is looking at this with the 144,000 and the background of this as he is reaching back into the Old Testament. And it's not specifically talking about this in the book of Revelation, but we can draw the correlation and we can understand this area in Revelation so much more if we go back and we look at Ezekiel and his restoration vision concerning this. Okay, so again, we are talking about Revelation 7, but what we want to go into just a little bit here is Ezekiel's restoration visions in Ezekiel 9, in Ezekiel 37, and in Ezekiel 48. Okay? And so in order to understand this connection, we have to look at 3 major themes in Ezekiel's presence, in his presentation there, that reappear in Revelation. Okay? And so as we're looking at this, John's vision of the 144,000 from the tribes of Israel in Revelation 7 draws heavily from the themes found in Ezekiel's restoration prophecies, especially chapters 9, 37, and 48. Now, the first century Jewish readers would likely recognize these connections immediately because Ezekiel was one of the primary prophets describing how God would preserve and restore his covenant people after judgment. So remember that there are so many different things in the Old Testament, prophecy-wise, that are pointing to the future. The book of Daniel, the book of Ezekiel, the book of Hosea, there's various ones there that are pointing to the future. Okay? So when we look at this, in Revelation 7, we've talked about the sealing of the 144,000, right? Ezekiel 9 also talks about that, because in Ezekiel 9, before divine judgment falls on Jerusalem, a heavenly messenger is told to mark the foreheads of those who grieve over sin and corruption. So this is back in Ezekiel, and this is a typology and a symbolism of what's going on in Revelation 7. Those who receive the mark are spared from destruction, just like the 144,000. So this is one of the clearest Old Testament backgrounds to Revelation. So in Revelation 7, something similar happens because the servants of God are sealed in their foreheads. The coming judgments are temporarily held back, because remember that chapter 7 is an interlude. It's kind of a pause. It's kind of a breather, a breather from one part of destruction to the other. And so the coming judgments are temporarily held back until the seal is completed. That's what that's what the elder was telling John. These are going to be the ones that are going to be sealed in their foreheads. And so a Jewish audience would understand this message. God always identifies and preserves a faithful remnant before judgment. Thus, the tribal lists function like a symbolic census of those marked for protection and salvation. Okay, so that's one part. Now, the restoration and reunification of Israel. Ezekiel 37 as compared to Revelation 7. In Ezekiel 37, the prophet sees the famous Valley of the Dry Bones. Remember, Ezekiel comes in and God shows him this Valley of the Dry Bones, and God asks him the questions, can these bones live again? And Ezekiel says, only you know, Lord, right? Doesn't that kind of sound a little bit like when John asks, when the elder is talking here and says, who are these people? And John says, only you know, right? And so that Valley of the Dry Bones in Ezekiel 37 symbolizes Israel's national death, but future resurrection, in the same way that it talks about in Revelation 7. The prophecy of the two sticks, representing Judah and Ephraim being reunited into one nation. This goes along with Ezekiel 37 also. And so what the vision promises is national renewal, spiritual revival, and covenant restoration. God is still in the mercy business. He is still in the saving business, even during the Great Tribulation. And he wants the Jewish people to understand that Jesus was the Messiah and to come to him as their Savior. Now, there are going to be a lot of people, including a lot of Jewish people, that are going to be deceived by the Antichrist, thinking that he is the Messiah. As we study on in Revelation, there will be some different quote-unquote miracles that the Antichrist and the beast will perform, but they will be more like a sleight of hand type of a thing. They will not actually be miracles. And so this is going to lead people to believe, oh, this is the Messiah. They didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah because they crucified him. But they will believe that the Antichrist is the Messiah. And so in this particular area here, what's happening there is that that people are going to look at the Antichrist as the Messiah rather than Jesus as the Messiah. So what we've got in this vision in Ezekiel is we've got the national renewal. We've got the spiritual revival. We've got the covenant restoration. And so we will see the covenant restoration in coming out of the Great Tribulation of these Jews that are being restored back to God. They're being restored back to knowing that Jesus is actually the Messiah. Okay? And so Revelation echoes this theme by presenting a numbered, restored people of God drawn from all of the tribes and coming back. Okay? Okay. Now, as this happens, John presents the restoration in apocalyptic symbolic form. And so the progression here, Ezekiel describes the restoration of Israel as a people. Revelation portrays the final redeemed covenant community. And it is it's still the Jews, still coming from the tribes there, and they are being restored in there. Okay? Now, the reordered tribal structure in the future kingdom, Ezekiel 48 and Revelation 7. So in Ezekiel 48, the prophet describes an ideal future distribution of tribal land. The tribal order is a little bit different from the earlier Old Testament arrangements. Levi receives a special central sacred portion. We've already talked a little bit about Levi in the last video that we had. And the layout is highly symbolic and theological. This shows that prophetic visions could restructure Israel's tribal order to communicate restoration themes rather than a historical geography. And so Revelation does this similarly, as we talked about in the last video, that the reordering of the tribes. The tribes are listed in the unusual order there. And so there are some that are omitted, there are some that are put in. And the structure emphasizes spiritual purity and covenant completeness. And so the Jewish reader would recognize this pattern of prophetic symbolism describing a renewed Israel. Okay? Now, there's a deep structural parallel between the two books. Ezekiel describes the marking of the righteous. Revelation describes the sealing of the 144,000. Ezekiel shows judgment following the marking. Revelation shows tribulation following the sealing. Ezekiel promises national restoration. Revelation shows eschatological redemption. Okay? Eschatology is the study of the end times. In case you missed that term there. Ezekiel rearranges the tribal geography. Revelation rearranges the tribal identity. Ezekiel centers restoration around a future temple. Revelation centers it around God's heavenly throne. Okay? So back in Ezekiel, this represents the restoration in a national and temple-centered terms. And Revelation expands this restoration into a cosmic, global, and final redemption. Okay? Okay. Now, so why does this connection help explain the meaning of the 144,000? Understanding Ezekiel's background suggests that the 144,000 represent a restored covenant people, a faithful remnant preserved through judgment, a spiritually reorganized Israel, a priestly community prepared for God's final kingdom. And so that is going to strengthen the interpretation that the tribal lists are visionary and theological and not merely just genealogical or demographic. Okay? But that is probably all that we need to cover on the 144,000 here. So, since this one was such a shorty, only about 13 minutes, I'll probably just hook it on to the other one. I expected to go a little bit longer. But anyway, so that is a little bit more about the 144,000. I'm going to try to do a couple more of these type of videos when I don't really have time in the Saturday night sessions to explain all of this. So I hope that you've enjoyed that, and we will see you on the next round.